So this video is going to cover slide 15, not 15, nope. That's our second take 2 of the day. This video is going to cover slide number 16, slide number 17, slide number 18. 16, 17, and 18. So on the last video, I ended with the fear response network in the brain that is part of our biological preparedness to signal fear and learn how to protect ourselves in times of danger. So this is relevant to the causes of generalized anxiety disorder. I just talked about the causes of phobias on previous videos. Now I want to talk about the causes of generalized anxiety disorder, which I talked about at length in the beginning of our anxiety disorder unit. There is a biological dimension, there is a cognitive dimension. Now, in this class, as I mentioned way at the beginning of the semester, I'm going to focus predominantly, when I talk about causes, I'm going to focus predominantly on that which the empirical data most supports. So people's theories, that's one thing, but I'm always going to take a scientist practitioner approach that we focus on the presumed causes and the best treatments that are most supported by the data, the research. So causes of generalized anxiety disorder in terms of the multi-path model that we talked about at the beginning of the semester and that your textbook weaves all the way through. The two most strongly supported in terms of causes of generalized anxiety disorder from a research perspective are biological and cognitive. So we're going to talk about those two. Let's start with the biological dimension. The studies suggest that people who are more likely to develop generalized anxiety disorder have a malfunction in that very fear response pathway or network in the brain that I talked about on the prior slide. That amygdala, prefrontal cortex, hippocampal, communicative set of structures. And so the idea is, remember from the last video, the amygdala signals the fear and says something's wrong here. Pay attention. And it starts to cause the other structures in the fear network of the brain to begin to pay attention and begin to signal. The hippocampus, remember, stores the fear memory for future reference so that you're prepared the next time. And the prefrontal cortex, remember, evaluates the level of threat that the stimulus actually causes. So, brain imaging studies. Now, I talked to you about brain imaging and how important it is in assessment when we talked about assessment, right, in our prior unit. Remember what an fMRI does. Remember what a PET scan does. I talked at length about those structures, right? I'll just give you a quick summary because I spent a lot of time explaining them in prior videos. But remember, the functional MRI gives you a sense of which areas of the brain are more or less active depending on oxygenated blood flow. Remember, a PET scan gives you an idea of which parts of the brain are more or less active based on a radioactive dye that crosses the blood-brain barrier and how much of that is metabolized sugars it attaches to glucose, right? So what studies using these brain imaging techniques reveal is that overactive fear pathways in the brain are more likely in people who develop generalized anxiety disorders and actually anxiety disorders in general. The idea is that those structures in the brain are responsive even if there's no stimuli present that should trigger potential fear. So for all of us, if you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden, boom, someone jumps out from behind a tree to scare you, your fear response pathway is going to be activated immediately. Your amygdala is going to say, what the hell, shit, something just happened. And your prefrontal cortex is going to say, okay, is this something I should be worried about? Is this something I need to protect myself from? But what happens when there's nothing? There's no stimulus in the environment that should trigger those structures. That's what we mean by overactive fear network. It's as if it's having a false alarm response and it's beginning to respond as if there's something, some stimulus you're confronted with that could potentially be threatening, but there isn't. So genes, so there's a genetic piece here. Why would some people have an overactive fear response network? Well, this is where genetics and heritability come into play. Remember what heritability means. It means that something has some degree of genetic component to it, that you inherit genes that influence that in some way. Genes related to the serotonergic pathways in the brain. Serotonergic pathways are brain pathways that carry the neurotransmitter known as serotonin. Now, one of the things we know about serotonin levels in the brain is that if your serotonin levels are too low, that is associated with increased anxiety and depression. And we know from research that depressed serotonin levels, decreased serotonin levels, may explain the overactive fear network. The overactive amygdala that's constantly signaling that there's something to worry about, even if there isn't, and the weak connectivity between that signaling of the amygdala and other structures of the brain in the fear network that should be able to dampen that response. And so one of the most critical neurotransmitters in understanding the biological components of generalized anxiety disorder is serotonin, insufficient serotonin. Now, that's not the only chemical component of an overactive fear network. Recent studies also indicate that there are other neurotransmitters that are critical to understanding how the brain Take 3. Okay, let's try this again, shall we? Other neurotransmitters in the brain have been identified as critical to understanding the overactivity of the fear network in the brain that signals threat when there is none. Gaba, which is that's an acronym for gamma aminobutyric acid, and glutamate. Now, in your brain, the balance of GABA and glutamate are very important. They're like a check and balance system on the activity of your brain. Your glutamate is what we call an excitatory neurotransmitter. Excitatory. It wants to go, 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 which means when you release glutamate from a neuron, it causes other neurons to fire. It sets things in motion biochemically. When your brain releases GABA, that's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It slows things down. So glutamate, go, 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 go. GABA, slow things down. Take a pause for the cause. Okay? Now, this is important because in the brain, the balance of glutamate and GABA work together and they control the overall level of excitation in the brain. If you have these out of balance, that's a problem. If your glutamate is highly active or overactive and you have insufficient GABA, then you can guess it. Your brain's going to be going, 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 and there's nothing to slow it down, right? On the other hand, if you had very little or insufficient glutamate and too much GABA, then you would always be like this. You would not be thinking very quickly. Everything would be, oh. Your brain would be in a state of constant sedation. So it's really critical that we have a proper balance of these two chemicals. What the research indicates is that in people who have generalized anxiety disorder, they have too much glutamate in the brain, so too much excitation, firing, 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 insufficient GABA. So that constant alarm, that constant processing in the fear network of the brain is because there's too much glutamate and not enough GABA to slow it down. And we know if we give people medications that elevate the level of GABA in their brain, it alleviates symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. So it seems by elevating GABA and slowing down the excitation of the fear network, we reduce the generalized anxiety disorder symptoms. Now, there seems to be some heritability to this. Remember, again, what that means, that we inherit genes that in this case would make our brain, our fear network, more likely to overact because of insufficient GABA. And so the heritability studies show that if you compare identical and fraternal twins, remember, Identical twins are twins that share all of their DNA. Fraternal twins only share half of their DNA. Studies suggest if you compare identical twins to fraternal twins, then this suggests that generalized anxiety disorder has moderate levels of heritability. And what that means is it's not completely genetically influenced, but there is some degree of influence of the genes you inherit that influence the biochemistry of that fear network in the brain. And we do this by a term that I mentioned earlier in the semester, concordance rates. Remember I told you that was one word of a few that I shared that was going to be very important. Remember what a concordance rate is. It is a statistical measure of the likelihood that two people will develop the same characteristic or the same disorder. When we compare concordance rates in identical twins and fraternal twins, we find that identical twins have statistically higher concordance for generalized anxiety disorder than fraternal twins, which means if you are an identical twin and one of you, of the two twins, has generalized anxiety disorder, the other is at a statistically higher risk of also developing the same generalized anxiety disorder in his or her lifetime than a fraternal twin whose brother or sister has the disorder. And that suggests that there's a heritability component, because when you share all of your genes with the affected person, your chances are higher than if you only share half of the genes with an affected person. Okay, so let's move on to slide number 17. I just need to take a drink because when I talk a lot, I get dehydrated. Let's talk about panic disorder, because what's interesting is panic disorder shows similar biological deficits as generalized anxiety. Literally, overactivity in the same brain areas that are also associated with risk for generalized anxiety disorder. That same fear pathway, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. And like generalized anxiety disorder, the same neurochemicals, the same neurotransmitters, serotonin insufficient, Gaba insufficient, are important. Studies also suggest, now this is, some of you have different biology backgrounds than others. So for some of you, everything I'm talking about in this set of slides probably makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of biology background. For those of you who don't have as much biology background, I hope that I'm giving you sufficient information to understand how this works, because it's very important. What studies show is that not only do people with panic disorder have low levels compared to the average of serotonin and GABA, which is important for the same reasons I just explained on the prior slide as related to generalized anxiety disorder, but it's also the case, and we're going to go to slide 18 for a minute, it's also the case that people with panic disorder on average have significantly fewer receptors for these chemicals. Fewer receptors for serotonin, fewer receptors for GABA than controls, which means compared to people who do not have a diagnosis of panic disorder. So let me show you what this means. If you've ever taken an introductory biology course at some point in your life, high school, college, whatever, you may remember that we have receptors on neurons. So when an electrical charge comes down our neuron, we call the neuron doing the firing the presynaptic neuron. Electrical, because we are electrochemical. So an electrical charge comes down the neuron that causes the release of neurotransmitters in the presynaptic neuron. In the receiving neuron, also known more technically as the postsynaptic neuron, the synapse is the space between the two, the space between the neuron that does the firing and the neuron that does the receiving. Well, on the postsynaptic neuron, there are what we call receptors. These are sites to which specific neurotransmitters, when they are released, bind. And they fit right in that receptor, so that when they fit into that receptor and the receptor absorbs the neurotransmitter, it causes the postsynaptic neuron to do something, to fire or not fire. Well, what studies show is that people with generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder seem to have fewer receptors for GABA and serotonin. Now, what this means is even if people with those disorders had the same amount of those neurotransmitters being released as anybody, they would still have less of a chance of slowing down the overexcitation of the brain, of the fear network, because there are not as many receptors on the receiving neuron, on the postsynaptic neuron, for those chemicals. What that means is it's not as easy for the brain's excitation level to dampen. Because if you don't have sufficient numbers of those receptors for the chemicals that slow the brain down, no matter how many of those chemicals are released, they're still not going to have as strong of an impact on the brain, because there's not as many receptors designed to be influenced by them. You see a picture on slide 18 where I show you GABA, for example, being released, and there's a site on the postsynaptic neuron to which that GABA binds. When that GABA binds to the receptor for it, that slows the excitation of the brain down because it inhibits the firing of neurons. It's an inhibitory chemical. If it were an excitatory chemical like glutamate, the opposite would happen. It would bind to the receptor and the neuron would fire. Okay, so now, before we get out of this video and move on to the next video, I want to talk about what's on slide 19. I want to continue with the discussion of generalized anxiety disorder from a multipath perspective. Now, I'm not going to explain slide 19 until the next video. I just want to introduce it by saying I've spent this whole video talking about the biological component of generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder, and there's a fair amount of research to support that biological component. But remember, the multipath model dictates that there's often more than one component interacting to explain the causes of a given disorder. That is true here. So on the next video, we're going to talk about the psychological and the social and sociocultural dimensions of generalized anxiety and panic that interact with the biological piece. See you there. Spend some time thinking about these biological components, and I'll see you soon.